devastating weapon designed to kill thousands of people as quickly as possible. A weapon so terrible, nations agreed to the Geneva Protocol to eliminate its use. Though when it comes to poison gas, the idea that simply breathing could do away with those who are called enemies is very difficult to resist. Let's welcome into the Hardline, contributor at the Weekly Standard, author of the article The Forbidden Weapon, 100 Years of Gas Warfare, appearing as the cover story on the Weekly Standard. Geoffrey Norman joins us. Geoffrey, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Geoffrey, that's the thing I believe that stops a lot of people when we look back at warfare. This was the use of chlorine gas by the Germans. It was meant to kill, and kill as many people as possible. In war, that's supposed to be the general aim. You're supposed to kill the enemy. So were people then even just saying, yeah, this is the right thing to do because we have to win regardless of what happens, what the outcome might be?
I think that's the case. I think everybody was very happy to sign on to the first treaties outlawing the use of gas warfare back in 1899. And among the signatories was Germany, and they were the first to use lethal poison gas. The French had actually used non-lethal gas prior to that. This first German use was on April 22nd, 1915, so it was just slightly over 100 years ago.
Well, there was a treaty that they had signed at that point where they had agreed not to use it, but then the Germans agreed to use it anyway. So is that simply it, that the history of gas warfare, we can maybe boil it down to the fact that you have someone who has a weapon that is so disastrous and so evil in so many ways that if you really want to kill somebody, it is tough to get away from using it?
Well, I think in warfare, everybody's always looking for whatever advantage they can find, technological or tactical. The results of the Germans breaking the treaty was to make the world, which was already pretty much disinclined to their point of view, hate them, if you will, even more. And it also inspired their enemies, Germany's enemies, to retaliate, and they retaliated in kind. So gas warfare became pretty much the norm on the Western Front in the First World War. And there's a very horrible sort of statistics and a kind of a legacy and painting and poetry about the horrors of gas warfare.
I don't even want to get into the poetry of it because you're right, but there are some people who see it that way, but the horrors of it are just despicable for those people that come back and look at some of the history. But here we are 100 years later. We have Saddam Hussein, who gassed his own people. We currently have Bashar al-Assad, who is allegedly gassing his own people as well. So who's actually trying to stop this? I mean, we have protocols and rules, but still, this is war, Geoffrey. Who's out there right now trying to bring this under control, if anybody?
I think your last two words pretty much answer the question. The president said that the use of what we now call weapons of mass destruction, which includes nukes, biological weapons, and gas, chemical weapons, he called the use of that a red line, but it's still unclear what happens when you cross the red line. There was a report in the Times, New York Times, just a few days ago, 2 or 3 days ago, saying that Bashar al-Assad is still dropping poison gas on his own citizens in the form of barrel bombs dropped from helicopters. And these barrel bombs contain chlorine gas, which was the kind that was first used by the Germans back in 1915.
Are we not talking, though, about a much deadlier gas than they used 100 years ago? I mean, certainly you have to look at, and I hate to say this, but improvements, if you will, in gas, the gas that's used today, that no one seems to be looking at from an international perspective, is so much more deadly.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, Assad also used a gas called sarin, which is a nerve gas. Much deadlier and harder to cope with than what the Germans originally used, which was chlorine. So yeah, it's gas warfare, like all other technological forms of warfare, has improved, if you will, over the course of a century.
I only got about 30 seconds left here, so I do want to leave it at this. Is there anybody, we mentioned the president's red line, but is there anybody out there who's really trying to honestly hold the use of these weapons down and being effective?
I don't think so. I think the only way you can is through, really severe retaliation. People have got to be afraid to use these weapons.
And it would seem that they are not afraid to use it. That is the problem. I want to remind everybody once again, the article is The Forbidden Weapon, 100 Years of Gas Warfare, and it is the cover story at the Weekly Standard magazine. Geoffrey, it's frightening. People need to read it because it still goes on today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Let's make sure that we now ask you then, the use of gas in warfare, is it something that if you're going to win and you want to kill the enemy that you should use, or is it just as reprehensible now, maybe even more so than it was 100 years ago? Tell us on Facebook at The Hardline, Twitter at Hardline. We'll listen and we'll talk about it as well. This is the fastest 60 minutes in news. The Hardline continues.